The courtroom in downtown Dallas buzzed with murmurs. It was supposed to be a routine morning, one of those cases that shuffled quietly through the docket. But as the doors swung open and Representative Jasmine Crockett walked in alone, briefcase in hand, an unusual energy shifted the air. Crockett, typically seen sparring on the House floor or firing off sharp, precise statements on national news, was here today not as a politician, but as a defendant. The case? City of Dallas versus Jasmine Crockett. A dispute stemming from a civil citation over an alleged zoning violation on one of her Dallas properties, her campaign office to be specific. The city alleged the building was being used outside its permitted purposes due to a temporary community clinic she had allowed to operate during the recent cold snap. It wasn't high-stakes litigation, or so it seemed. Judge Ronald E. Markham, a man known in the Dallas legal circuit for his curt manner and old-school courtroom attitude, raised an eyebrow the moment she approached the defense table. He leaned over the bench, tapped his microphone, and half-chuckled. "Ms. Crockett, you're representing yourself today? No counsel willing to take your case?" A wave of laughter rippled through the gallery, mostly older lawyers waiting for their turn on the docket, a few interns pretending not to smirk. Crockett, unbothered, gave a slight nod and placed a thick folder on the table. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor. Shouldn't be too complicated." Her tone was even, controlled, but sharp enough to slice through the mockery. Markham huffed, leaned back, and gestured to the city attorney. "Let's get this started, then." The city presented its case quickly. Too quickly. A few photographs, some loosely connected testimonies from city employees, and a questionable inspection notice that had been slid under the office door in the dead of night, conveniently dated 2 days after the clinic had already ceased operations. Then, it was Crockett's turn. She approached the bench with precision, not a hint of hesitation in her stride. From the very beginning, her command of the room shifted the tone. She didn't fumble for evidence. She didn't grope for words. She cited zoning codes, emergency ordinance exceptions, and precedent from 3 previous cases involving temporary humanitarian use of private property in crisis conditions, cases most lawyers would need a week to dig up. She laid them all out neatly, referencing binders she'd compiled herself. By the 20-minute mark, the room was silent. No one was laughing. Except Judge Markham, though his laughter had turned bitter, almost irritated. "Ms. Crockett, I'm not here for a TED Talk on emergency management law. You're on trial, not campaigning." A few quiet gasps from the gallery, but Crockett remained calm. She tilted her head slightly. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I'm simply establishing my right to due process. This is not about politics, it's about the law." That's when the mood really shifted. Markham's face tensed, and he leaned forward. "This is my courtroom, Congresswoman, and your attitude won't get you very far here. You're not on Capitol Hill." The tension was now a thick rope stretching across the courtroom. Crockett didn't flinch. "I'm well aware," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the judge. "That's why I brought the law with me." She resumed her defense with unwavering focus. Her documentation revealed that not only had the clinic been permitted under emergency relief measures quietly passed by the city council, but that the property had been listed in a city database as an approved temporary use site. She presented internal emails obtained through a FOIA request, showing city employees acknowledging the site's approval weeks before the citation was issued. Then she pulled out the real surprise: a time-stamped photo from a security camera showing the city inspector dropping the notice after business hours, contradicting sworn testimony just minutes earlier. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Judge Markham stared at the photograph for several seconds before dismissing it with a wave of his hand. "Photographs can be doctored. I'll remind you again, Ms. Crockett, this is not a federal hearing. We don't tolerate theatrics here." His tone was growing sharper, louder. His composure fraying. Crockett responded in a measured tone. Are you suggesting I fabricated city-issued footage, Your Honor? Or are we disregarding evidence now based on how uncomfortable it makes us feel? Markham's face flushed a shade deeper. Watch your tone. One more outburst like that, and I'll hold you in contempt. But the gallery wasn't with the judge anymore. The city attorney avoided eye contact. A few reporters began quietly typing notes with renewed interest. Even the bailiff seemed to be following along now with greater intensity. Crockett returned to her seat without saying another word. Her presence had shifted from the defendant to the quiet force commanding the entire room. At recess, whispers surged through the hallway. Reporters called their editors. Someone leaked footage of the judge's earlier dismissive comments. Twitter began to stir. But what came next wasn't just whispers. As court resumed, a low-voiced man in a plain blue suit approached the clerk's desk. He looked out of place, too quiet, too careful. He handed over a sealed envelope, leaned in, and said something that froze the clerk mid-sentence. She stood, walked straight to Judge Markham, and whispered in his ear. Markham's jaw clenched. He turned pale. Jasmine Crockett didn't move, but her eyes locked on him. She knew something had shifted. She could feel it. Judge Markham cleared his throat. This court will recess until tomorrow morning, he announced abruptly. Due to a matter requiring judicial review, the courtroom erupted. Phones came out. Camera crews scrambled outside. Reporters began live streaming instantly. Because what was in that envelope would crack this case wide open. And tomorrow morning's session would be the one Dallas would never forget. By 8 a.m., a line had formed outside the courthouse. Not just curious locals, but full-fledged national media outlets had descended like vultures with lenses. CNN, MSNBC, even international crews. The night before, someone leaked just enough to send ripples through the country. A whistleblower had come forward, and what they had delivered had already been sealed and added to the case file. Inside, the courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Jasmine Crockett sat quietly at her table, a neutral expression masking the fire behind her eyes. Her suit was sharper today, darker. Her posture was steel. Across the room, Judge Ronald E. Markham entered 20 minutes late. His usual self-important strut was absent. His robes rustled with just a bit too much tension. All rise, the bailiff called. But today, no one stood with enthusiasm. Markham didn't acknowledge it. He sat, shuffled his notes, and gave a stiff nod. This court is now in session. Crockett stood. Before we resume proceedings, I would like to request clarification on the sealed contents submitted yesterday. Markham's jaw twitched. The court will not be discussing those materials at this time. The contents are relevant, she cut in, calm and direct. Because if the documents suggest what I believe they do, Your Honor, then the foundation of this case is corrupted. And perhaps more importantly, so is the bench overseeing it. Gasps again. Cameras flashed. The room shifted from anticipation to live wire. The judge slammed his gavel. Ms. Crockett, you're skating dangerously, close to contempt. And you're skating dangerously close to obstruction, she replied without flinching. Let the record reflect that I am making a formal motion to unseal the documents. As a defendant, I have the right to confront any evidence impacting this case, especially when it involves judicial misconduct. There it was. She'd said it plainly, judicial misconduct. Markham opened his mouth to respond, but before a word escaped, the doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. A figure in a gray suit entered, balding, quiet, holding a small case. He walked quickly to the prosecution's side and handed a folder to the city attorney, whispering just loud enough for the nearest journalists to catch. It's all there, including the emails. Markham's voice cut like a blade. Who is that man? The city attorney, looking suddenly like he'd seen a ghost, swallowed hard. He's with Internal Affairs, Your Honor. sent from the Office of Court Administration. They've opened a preliminary review based on last night's allegations. Crockett turned her head slightly, enough to make eye contact with the cameras. She didn't need to say a word. The optics said everything. "I would like to enter this development into the record," she said. Markham, pale now, fought to regain control. "You're overreaching, Ms. Crockett. This is a minor zoning case. This is not a political theater. This is my courtroom." Crockett stepped forward, placing her hands firmly on the table. "And that's precisely the problem, isn't it?" Pin drop. "Silence," she continued. "It's not your courtroom. It belongs to the people. And if a sitting judge is willing to suppress evidence, smear a black woman representing herself, and weaponize bias to force a false narrative, then this courtroom is the exact place to expose it." Markham's composure broke. "You're grandstanding?" "No," she said, her voice steady. "I'm surviving." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a printed document. "This," she said, holding it up, "is an internal memo from your office, Your Honor, dated 4 days before my citation was even issued. In it, a staffer raises concerns about me creating a spectacle during election season. It ends with a note in your handwriting, confirmed by a forensic analyst, saying, 'Let's bury her in red tape.'" A low chorus of murmurs spread, like wildfire through the room. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Markham said, though his voice cracked. "I do," she replied, "because I've lived it. Because every time a woman of color walks into a courtroom and dares to stand her ground, the rules shift, the tone changes, the burden multiplies." The city attorney stood, interrupting. "Your Honor, given the gravity of these accusations and the mounting evidence, the city is withdrawing the complaint. Effective immediately." The courtroom erupted. Markham slammed the gavel repeatedly. "Order! This case!" But no one listened. The gallery was in chaos. Reporters ran out mid-sentence to call their networks. Crockett remained calm, her gaze fixed squarely on the man behind the bench. And then, another crack in the wall. The man from Internal Affairs approached the judge directly, handing him a small envelope marked "Confidential, Emergency Oversight, Notice." Markham's hand trembled as he opened it. His eyes scanned the lines, lips tightening with each word. Then he whispered something to the bailiff. The bailiff hesitated. "Now," the judge hissed, but the bailiff didn't move. Instead, he turned to the Internal Affairs officer and nodded. That's when Crockett knew. The tide had turned. Still, she didn't move. She waited, quiet, unshaken. Markham stood, but the strength was gone. "This hearing is adjourned," he muttered. "Not yet, it's not," said the man from Internal Affairs. "Under order from the Judicial Conduct Review Board, this bench is being suspended pending formal investigation. You are instructed to remain in the courthouse until escorted for questioning." Crockett exhaled, her first real breath in hours. The judge didn't respond. He simply turned and walked into his chambers, without dignity, without applause. Outside, the story was already exploding. News anchors used words like historic, shocking, and systemic reckoning. Protesters gathered with signs in support of Crockett. Others came holding signs against judicial overreach and courtroom corruption. But inside, the storm hadn't passed. Not yet, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. Not when her experience could help tear down the walls too many others had been crushed beneath. And she was about to make sure no one looked away again. In the days that followed, the Dallas County courthouse transformed from a house of order into a ground zero for reckoning. Every camera in the country was now trained on a courtroom that, for years, had operated in plain sight, quietly weaponizing the system against those with the least power to fight back, and at the heart of it all stood Jasmine Crockett. The judge's chambers were sealed by the end of that week. Markham had been placed on administrative leave, but pressure mounted fast and public. News outlets uncovered a pattern of questionable rulings, cases dismissed without merit, defendants disproportionately penalized, and minority women routinely discredited on the record. But the city didn't stop at a review. Following a viral broadcast of Crockett's confrontation with Judge Markham, now dubbed the Crockett docket by national media, protesters began filling the courthouse steps. Law students, civil rights activists, and faith leaders stood shoulder to shoulder with banners that read, "Justice is not a personality," and "Courtrooms are not thrones." Yet Crockett didn't revel in the spotlight. Her focus shifted immediately to action. 2 days after the courtroom eruption, she convened a town hall just blocks from the courthouse, pulling together local public defenders, victims of previous judicial bias, and even retired judges who had long stayed silent. Cameras rolled, but Crockett spoke as if the cameras weren't there. "We're not just talking about one man," she said, gripping the microphone tightly. "We're talking about the entire scaffolding that let him rule like a king over people's futures. We're talking about years of unchecked power, ignored warnings, and a justice system so comfortable with its own reflection that it stopped seeing the people in front of it." The crowd roared. That same night, the Office of Judicial Conduct confirmed that Judge Ronald Markham was under full investigation, not just for misconduct in Crockett's case, but for more than 17 prior complaints that had mysteriously been dismissed or resolved quietly. But the final blow didn't come from an oversight board. It came from the courtroom he once commanded. A special session was called, open to the public, broadcast live. Markham, now a shadow of the man who once mocked a sitting U.S. representative in his own courtroom, sat quietly at a long oak table. His defense attorney attempted to portray the incident as misunderstanding and unintentional oversight, but then came the whistleblower, Tyree Maddox, a former court clerk who'd worked under Markham for 7 years. Clean record. Trusted. Under oath, Maddox testified that he'd witnessed repeated manipulation of docket orders, unrecorded sidebar conversations pressuring city attorneys to keep it messy when women of color represented themselves, and perhaps most damning, direct orders to suppress or delay filings that might clear certain defendants. He produced emails, voice recordings, and handwritten notes. One note read plainly, "Crockett's clinic move is a stunt. We'll trip her up in court. Watch her fold." But she didn't fold. By the time Maddox left the stand, there wasn't a single person in the courtroom questioning what had really gone on behind those benches. Within 48 hours, a warrant was signed. Judge Ronald E. Markham was arrested on charges including obstruction of justice, tampering with public records, and abuse of judicial authority. His mugshot was aired live on the same news stations that once played his gavel slams as sound bites of authority. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Still, Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't tweet a victory lap or do a round of morning show interviews with a triumphant grin. Instead, she called a press conference, not in D.C., but in front of the same courthouse steps where it all began, flanked by young black women in law school, single mothers who'd once been silenced by courtrooms like Markham's, and even a few of the city officials who initially dismissed her case. She stood behind a podium and delivered the closing statement she never got to give. "This was never about a zoning citation," she began. "It was about how quickly power can corrupt, and how silently that corruption can take root when no one's willing to speak up. I was underestimated because I was black, because I was a woman, and because I had the audacity to believe I could fight the system from within. And still, I showed up. I stood my ground. Not because I thought I'd win, but because I knew someone had to." She paused, then lifted her eyes to meet the crowd. "And now, we change things. Not just here, but everywhere." Within a month, sweeping reforms were proposed across Dallas County. Mandatory bias training for all judicial officers, an independent oversight committee with real power to investigate judicial conduct, and perhaps most significantly, a community legal advocate program, offering legal resources and education to those who couldn't afford traditional representation. Jasmine Crockett was invited to help draft the reforms, not because she demanded it, but because no one could deny she'd earned that seat at the table. The woman who walked into court to defend herself against a $20,500 civil citation had ignited a movement that would ripple through courthouses across Texas and beyond. In the final days of that legislative cycle, a young law student asked Crockett what gave her the courage to keep going after that first day in court, when she was mocked, dismissed, and nearly held in contempt. She smiled. Not a smug smile. A tired, knowing one. "They underestimated me," she said. "That was their first mistake. Their second was thinking I was standing alone." And with that, she walked away. Not just from the courthouse, but from a system that would never look the same again. Justice had been served. And this time, it came dressed in defiance, armed with truth, and spoken in the voice of a woman who refused to sit down.